Hello, Gates. George Harrison carried himself with a calm demeanor, rarely raising his voice or causing public scenes. Yet beneath that quiet exterior was a growing bitterness that began in the Beatles' earliest days and never completely healed. As a teenager in Liverpool, he met Paul McCartney on a school bus, bonding over chords and records. Paul was older, confident, and assertive, while George was shy and impressionable, drawn to Paul's confidence and later John Lennon's charisma. When George joined Lennon's group, the Quarrymen, at just 15, John thought he was too young. But George impressed him during a second audition by playing a guitar riff flawlessly. From the start, however, Lennon and McCartney dominated the creative core of what became the Beatles, leaving George to follow and learn. In the early Fame years, the press dubbed him the Quiet Beatle, a label that masked the reality that he often felt overlooked. His ideas passed over, and his guitar work micromanaged, especially by Paul, whose perfectionism could feel suffocating. Over time, admiration turned into resentment. And by the late 1960s, George was no longer content to stay silent. By the time they were recording the White Album in 1968, tensions had escalated. Paul's controlling nature in the studio, John's distraction with Yoko Ono, and George's growing determination to be heard created an explosive atmosphere. During the Let It Be sessions in early 1969, cameras caught a tense exchange where George, frustrated by Paul's instructions, told him he'd play whatever Paul wanted or nothing at all. It wasn't sarcasm but resignation, the result of years of feeling undervalued. Soon after, George temporarily quit the band, returning only after negotiating better terms. His return led to the creation of iconic songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, but the damage between him and Paul lingered. When the Beatles split in 1970, George's separation from Paul was as personal as it was professional. His acclaimed solo album All Things Must Pass included Wah, widely seen as a veiled jab at Paul's domineering ways. Even in later years, ex-wife Pattie Boyd recalled how George would come home from recording sessions angry after clashing with Paul, saying the two merely tolerated each other. They reunited for the 1994 anthology project, but old dynamics returned, with George quietly rolling his eyes at Paul's suggestions. Paul's overbearing style wasn't the only wound. George's relationship with Lennon was more complicated. Deep admiration in the early years slowly gave way to emotional distance. John mocked George's interest in Indian music and spirituality, which stung deeply. In his memoir, I, Me, Mine, George barely mentioned Lennon at all, an intentional omission that spoke volumes. When Lennon was killed in 1980, George mourned him through the song All Those Years Ago, balancing tribute with an acknowledgement of their strained, final years. Despite his success as a solo artist, the emotional scars from the Beatles' years persisted. In a 1975 interview, George admitted he'd lost confidence as a guitarist after years with Paul, not because of malice, but from constant second-guessing. He once said he'd gladly work with John again, but not with Paul, describing Paul as overpowering. In later life, when asked about the Beatles, George was blunt, saying he didn't miss being in the band with the others. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer, later spreading to his lungs and brain. During his final years, he largely stayed out of the public eye. In a rare 2001 online chat, when asked if Paul still annoyed him, he answered indirectly with an old proverb about overlooking a friend's flaws, his response philosophical yet pointed. Before his death in November 2001, Paul visited him and they sat holding hands, sharing quiet conversation. Paul later called him his baby brother, though whether full reconciliation occurred is uncertain. George Harrison left a legacy of music, spiritual searching, and quiet rebellion. He wasn't the loudest Beatle, but his feelings ran deep. Through decades of collaboration, friendship, and conflict, there was respect and even love. but also bitterness that time couldn't entirely erase. Even at the end, some relationships remained complicated, marked by unspoken truths that outlived the band itself.